Hello and welcome to this tutorial looking at question 2, paper 2, the narrative question. This is going to look at the technique with regards to this, but also look at some content as well. So I've mocked up a possible GCSE style question, and it is writing a narrative account analysing the main events in the superpower rivalry in Cuba in the years 1959 to 1962. And it says you may use the following: the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962. You must also include information of your own. So let's have a look and see how we could go about answering this and developing our ideas. So let's have a look at the question in depth. Here we've got the question, and underneath it we've got what the target is. So just going to use this, and we've got this idea of an analytical narrative. So it's an analysis, so there has to be some explanation, or some analysis should I say, of the causes of a key event and how things led on to different issues, so consequence and change. And then obviously knowledge and understanding is critical again. And if we have a look, we've got 4 marks a piece, 4 marks for the AO1, that's your knowledge, and 4 marks for your analytical narrative. We should try to get it done in 12 minutes. This one I would suggest getting it done. We're not going to write significantly long paragraphs, about 3 sentences per paragraph, but it's kind of critical that we are able to structure this, so it does require a little bit of effort on this one to really kind of use those 12 minutes fully. What are the exam board wanting? Well, if we have a look here, level 1, 1 to 2 marks. It's a simple, or it's a generalized narrative, so a very broad overview, shows the account, limited analysis. So in other words, you're just saying, well, this event led to this event, and there's no real explanation as to why. Limited knowledge, so you're using the stimulus material and basically adding something to it in very general terms, nothing very specific. Level 2, 3 to 5 marks, it says here the narrative is given showing some organization of the material into a sequence, so in other words, beginning, middle and end. So we know the Bay of Pigs is 61, we know the Cuban Missile Crisis is 62, so there we put things in more of a sequence. We would add a third point of our own to try and go beyond the 4 marks as shown there. The account shows of the event shows some analysis and linkage, so you're not just saying, well, this event and then there's this event. Now you're saying, well, this event led to this event, and as a consequence it then created this event. But it says that it can still lack coherence and organization. Now here we've got accurate and relevant information is added, and it's showing some knowledge and understanding of the events. So again, knowledge is being applied, but it's not very specific. If we have a look at level 3, it's clearly talking about organizes material in a clear sequence of the events leading to an outcome. It analyzes the links between them. So why does one event cause the next? And they are logically structured. Sorry, the pen's wobbling a bit there, or in fact the mouse is. Again, accurate, relevant information is included, and it's showing good knowledge this time, not just some, but good knowledge and understanding. And you can't get level 3 if you haven't got more than the stimulus material, so you've got to have added something of your own. So when you see this question, the first thing I would do is, before you even start the exam properly, is plan this out. You've got the Bay of Pigs invasion, that's 61. You've got Cuban Missile Crisis 62, so you need something in 1959. There's a clue there, and the answer is it's the Cuban Revolution. So what are the exam board wanting you to do? Well, I would have a look at this idea of a short paragraph, 3-sentence short paragraph. Identify the first event, give an example of it, i.e. adding a bit of detail, and explain its development. And then the second paragraph, you're going to link it. You're going to link that paragraph to this one here. So as a consequence of that, or this therefore led to, give an example of the new factor you're going to examine and explain its development. And then you would simply repeat all of that with paragraph 3. Let's start therefore by learning about the Cuban Revolution. Cuba, about 90 miles off the coast of the United States, south of Florida, it was dominated by US influence. It was in their area of sphere of influence, in effect. And it was led by a dictator called Batista, who was supported by the US. The US had a significant investment in Cuba in terms of a lot of the key industries, including sugar. Now, Fidel Castro led a revolution against Batista. It was very, very popular. Lots of the Cuban people were poor and they were sick and tired of this inequality. And Castro then nationalized the US companies, including some of the kind of sugar companies. The US placed an embargo, therefore, on Cuban goods, and this hurt Cuba economically. So Castro turned to the Soviets for help. So then the next key event as a consequence of that, notice that idea of consequence, connectives, is that we look at the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The CIA initially planned to try and kill Castro. President Eisenhower, who was president up to January 1961, authorized a plan to support Cuban exiles who'd lived in the US, in places like Florida, to invade Cuba and to overthrow Castro. And they would provide money, arms, training, advisors for this. Now, the belief was that these Cuban exiles, when they invaded, they would be very, very popular. They would lead a national revolt against Castro. But the CIA failed to really understand why Castro was popular, his socialist policies within Cuba, and how poor people were. So they were willing to support Castro because they simply didn't want to return to the old ways. The invasion therefore failed massively, and the new president, Kennedy, who was given this plan, refused to provide air support to the Cuban exiles, and it meant that the Cuban Exile Brigade failed in their invasion. Many were killed, a lot more were captured, and in the end, it wasn't until December 1962 that you began to see Cuban exiles being kind of brought back to the United States through a kind of a negotiation. The US ended up giving Cuba lots and lots of money to get these through aid to get these Cuban exiles back. But the immediate consequence of the Bay of Pigs invasion was that it led Castro to seek more support from the Soviet Union. He'd begun to receive economic support from the Soviet Union, but now he wanted that military assistance because he was worried that the United States would launch another attack against him. Therefore, as a consequence, it leads us to our final event, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. And this is where, linking back to the previous point, Castro's demands for help led the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, to provide military aid, which included nuclear weapons, in particular medium-range nuclear weapons. Khrushchev realized that if he put medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, it would massively expand the number of nuclear weapons which would be able to hit the United States. Previously, he would be just using long-range weapons. However, by putting medium-range ones in Cuba, he would be almost doubling up the number of nuclear weapons which could hit the United States without having to spend an awful lot more money on long-range ones. Now, the United States spotted the missile bases being developed in Cuba, and it led to a crisis. Kennedy developed a group called ExComm, the Executive Committee, to advise him, and the end product of that was a blockade that would go around Cuba using Navy ships to stop any more Soviet ships sailing in with missile parts and various other technology. Now, that wouldn't end the crisis. The original narrative was that Kennedy and Khrushchev kind of were playing brinkmanship here, much like this cartoon, kind of eyeball to eyeball. But that in the end, Khrushchev wrote a telegram saying, "I'll take the missiles out if you promise not to invade." Kennedy was going to agree to that massively. Then he sent a second letter saying, "Actually, we want more. We want missiles out of other American missiles out of bases near to the Soviet Union." In the end, the original narrative was that Kennedy agreed to letter 1 and didn't really pay attention to letter 2. However, secretly, the US removed their missiles from Turkey, but the Soviets moved theirs publicly. So as a result of this, the Americans looked like they'd won the Cuban Missile Crisis. They'd not backed down. It was Khrushchev. Kennedy's status as a global leader massively increased. Khrushchev was forced out of office as a result of this. But as a consequence, if you wanted to take this further, you'd say that as a consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it led to the development of a hotline, so you weren't relying on telegrams. There was a test ban treaty, and there were various other developments as well. The Kennedy looking like a global leader, Khrushchev being removed. But the time frame of the question is 62, so we would want to be finishing it in 62 and not really taking it further and getting the opportunity to lose marks by including things not within that time period. So here I've got an example paragraph 1 and 2. I'll just read it out. It's the first development in the superpower rivalry in Cuba in the years 1959 to 62 was the Cuban Revolution. This was when Fidel Castro led a revolution against US-backed dictator Batista. This was important because it led to increased tensions between Cuba and the US, and therefore Cuba began to look for help from the Soviet Union. As a result of this, the Americans embargoed trade with Cuba, and then when this didn't work, they organized an invasion of Cuba through the use of Cuban exiles. This was supported by the CIA, and it was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion failed. It didn't get support from the Cuban people that was expected, and as a result, the Cubans felt more threatened and looked for further help from the Soviet Union. Sorry, that should be looked there, but we'll move on. Now, if we analyze this, we can see here I've got my introduction, and this underlining here shows you my first kind of development, that this is a sequence. Then I've got my point. I'm going to look at the Cuban Revolution. I've backed it up with evidence, and I've explained why it was important in terms of Cuban within the focus of the question, the focus on Cuba. But in the second paragraph, I've got my the idea of sequencing again as a result of this, and we can see this moving further forward here as a result of. So here again, what we see is we've got this idea that that part is connected to this area here. As a result of the Cuban Revolution, the Americans embargoed trade with Cuba, and when this didn't work, it led to the invasion through Cuban exiles. I've got my evidence, and I've got, as a consequence of this, or as a result, the Cubans felt more threatened and looked for further help from the Soviet Union. And you can quite imagine how paragraph 3 would work. Well, that's how you would go about ensuring that you are getting the best opportunity to hit the high levels. So hope this has been useful. If there's any queries or questions regarding this, please feel free to pass on a comment. Hope it's been useful, and thank you for listening.